I think this also shows that it kind of shows Putin as a bit of a coward, considering he most likely fled Moscow at the first sign of danger.
Mm,
And in his morning address on Sunday, he vowed that there will be a tough response, and he said that the rebellion will be suppressed. But then, Prigozhin just gets to walk away, criminal charges dropped, as we learned today, probably not. But, it also wasn't Putin who made a deal with Prigozhin. It was Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, out of all the people, who
mm,
can be credited for finding a
absolutely.
solution that saved Russian lives.
Yeah. So, the world watched in horror over the weekend as Russia was brought to the brink of civil war by the disgruntled boss of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin. After leading his forces to within 250 miles of Moscow, Prigozhin suddenly called a surprise halt to proceedings, thus ending his uprising. He then agreed to some sort of self-exile, we're told, in Belarus, with all charges dropped against him and the Wagner group. But today, that appears to have changed. According to Russian media, the charges against him have not been dropped and an investigation is still ongoing. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says this has exposed real cracks in Putin's Russia, with internal government documents in the UK warning that Britain must prepare for the sudden collapse of Russia. I'm now joined by Uliana Pavlova, who covers Russia for CNN, and Radek Sikorski, the former Polish foreign minister and currently an MEP in the European Parliament. Welcome to the show, both of you.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good
Thank you for
afternoon.
having us.
Uliana, can I start with you? As is pretty clear from my introduction, nobody can quite get a handle on what on earth happened over the weekend, or indeed what the current situation is now.
So much to say about this. I think you are right in your assessment that the failed coup may keep Vladimir Putin in power for now, but it leaves his reputation severely bruised. We have already seen him today appear on state TV with his regular programming. He congratulated some folks with Engineering Forum, but he has not addressed what just happened. And we have not heard from Prigozhin ever since the coup. And we all know that he is a very vocal man. We actually already reached out to his press service, and they said that Prigozhin sends his regards and will respond as soon as he can. But no doubt this leaves Putin's reputation weaker. I think Prigozhin's rebellion showed just how fragile the whole political regime really is. And the fact that Prigozhin's troops were almost a step away from Moscow in just 24 hours and have notably met very little resistance along the way, I think it shows that Russian forces lack reserves in many rear areas. And also, I think it exposes some serious weakness of the Russian security services and their inability to suppress internal threats when it's not just a bunch of unarmed liberals, but an actual armed rebellion.
It is a complete mess and confusion, but there is no doubt at all, it seems to me as a layman observing, that Putin has been weakened. But is Prigozhin really in Belarus? What is that all about?
Unfortunately, we don't really know about Prigozhin's whereabouts at this moment. The last we have seen of him, he was leaving Rostov, and we could see him smiling and waving in the car, and people kind of rushing towards him to shake his hand and take pictures, which was a scene in itself. But I don't really know where this leaves Prigozhin. I doubt he would just be able to walk away from this unharmed. I think we yet have to see what happens. I think this also shows that it kind of shows Putin as a bit of a coward, considering he most likely fled Moscow at the first sign of danger.
Mm.
And in his morning address on Sunday, he vowed that there will be a tough response, and he said that the rebellion will be suppressed. But then, Prigozhin just gets to walk away, criminal charges dropped, as we learned today, probably not. But, it also wasn't Putin who made a deal with Prigozhin. It was Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, out of all the people, who
Mm.
can be credited for finding a
Absolutely.
solution that saved Russian lives.
Yeah. I'd like to bring in Radek Sikorski now. So as a former Polish foreign minister and now an MEP as well, and obviously with Poland playing such an absolutely vital role in supporting Ukraine. What are people saying about how these events are likely to affect the war in Ukraine?
Well, until recently, the Russian army and Wagner were both fighting Ukraine at Bakhmut, among other places. And today, one of those forces is somewhat neutralized. So that's good news for Ukraine. There is also a wonderful theory doing the rounds that Prigozhin must have believed that he had some support from inside Russian institutions, GRU or FSB or similar, and that there's a theory that he was a victim of a sting operation by the Ukrainian intelligence service, who made him believe that such support was forthcoming. If that were true, it would be a brilliant operation.
But there is also the other rumor. I've heard that rumor, but there's the other rumor that this was a sort of feint, a weird feint on behalf of the Russians to lure the Ukrainians, to give them a sense of confidence that they could kind of push on with their offensive. But I don't think that sounds very credible.
No, that doesn't work because the three lines of Russian defenses are unaffected. What has been exposed is that you can have a raid across 500 or 600 kilometers of Russia and encounter no resistance.
But do you think the morale of the Russian army in Ukraine must be at rock bottom now? Surely is there a real opportunity, do you think, for the Ukrainians to make advances? I'm saying
the morale is clearly bad enough to not to want to fight Wagner, but not bad enough to actually rebel and back Wagner. So what would be transformational? It would be a situation that Russia was in 1917, when soldiers were ready to shoot their officers rather than fight the Germans. And that produced the abdication of Nicholas II, and then first a liberal and then a Bolshevik revolution.
I mean, Uliana, Radek makes the point about 1917. Indeed, President Putin himself drew a parallel with 1917 in his first address. There is this narrative developing that whatever happens, it may not be what we understand as sort of conventional civil war in Russia, but because it's such a corrupt and kleptocratic state, you're basically going to get feuding oligarchs and private armies all trying to sort of get one over on each other.
I think this is certainly possible, but I also think this most likely will happen when Putin is no longer in power. And something interesting that I have noticed when this was happening over the weekend is that majority of Russian people really did not care. I just feel that the mood for a rebellion is just not there yet. People in Rostov could only be described as curious onlookers. And if I can provide an anecdote myself, I have a friend in Rostov, and on the day that Wagner took over Rostov and the Southern military headquarters, I texted him and I was like, "Hi, how are you? What is the situation like in Rostov?" And all I got was like, "Oh, it's fine. We just came back from the zoo." And I find this attitude very common among many Russians. Yes.
It is very depressing because what spoke to me when I heard stories like that is that the Russian people don't care because it doesn't matter who takes over from Putin. Nothing will happen in terms of Russia even coming close to ever becoming a sort of democracy or anything like that. I mean, the normal Russian just doesn't care because things will carry on as normal, whoever's in charge.
Yes, that's true. I think the common attitude of the Russian people is, oh, it's all politics. We can't influence anything anyway, so why even bother?
Yeah, absolutely. Radek Sikorski, have you been able to talk to any of your colleagues in the European Parliament? How is the European attitude changing in the light of these events and the thoughts about Ukraine in particular?
I'm on my way to Brussels when I finish this conversation, but I talk to friends and allies all the time, and whenever Ukraine is doing better, the support for it rises.
Yes.
So what I detect also from conversations with American colleagues is that the idea of inviting Ukraine, of issuing an invitation to join NATO, is gaining popularity.
Oh, that is interesting because that would be obviously highly controversial since some people attribute wrongly, obviously, that the war was caused by that, but that would be extraordinary. Is that realistic, do you think?
Well, invitation is not yet membership.
Yes.
And Ukraine has a first-class army now, the most experienced in Europe, and is clearly defending Europe from Putin. So the timing of actual membership is not going to be prejudged. But I think NATO is the only kind of security guarantee that the Ukrainians will accept.
Absolutely. Uliana Pavlova from CNN Russia and Radek Sikorski, the former Polish foreign minister and an MEP in the European Parliament. Thank you both for joining me.